Good evening, everyone. There we go. My name is Daniel, and I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory. The land in which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innuwak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. If you don't mind, one quick second. Just so you guys can hear me better. So we're gathered here this evening to celebrate the launch of the Canadian Shields, Stories and Essays by Carol Shields, edited, curated, and contextualized by Nora Foster Stovel. We're grateful to be working with the publisher of this volume, the University of Manitoba Press, to present this event. And this book brings together 50 short writings by Carol Shields, including more than 24 previously unpublished short stories and essays discovered by tonight's guest, alongside 24 essays previously published but never before collected. And in just a moment, I'll be bringing out the host for the event, Mavis Reimer, to introduce the evening. And following that, there'll be a presentation from Nora Foster Stovel before she joins Dr. Reimer for a discussion of this volume. And after that, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, at which point I will come by with this microphone, the wireless one, just to bring it over to you so that you're audible for the viewers who are watching from home on the live stream. So just raise your hand and I'll come by and then you can ask your question. And I will be back at the end to review the signing procedure, but for now I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's host. Mavis Reimer is a professor of English and director of the Center for Research in Young People's Texts and Cultures at the University of Winnipeg. Please join me in welcoming her.
Wait till it puts us on. All right, am I on? Okay. No? Doesn't sound like it. Mine's on. All right, now I'm there, right? Perfect. So I've known Nora for how long? Oh, okay, I won't say how long. For many, many years. Decades even. We met first when she was just finishing her PhD at Dalhousie University, and I was just starting my MA. And she reminded me actually at dinner tonight that we were in a graduate seminar together. I hadn't remembered the graduate seminar, but I did remember Nora because she was heading off to do a postdoctoral fellowship in Alberta right after her doctorate and leaving husband and children, I think, behind, right? So
I didn't leave them behind, but I commuted across the country for 2 years.
She commuted across the country for 2 years. She's correcting me. She didn't leave them behind. But this tells you, I think, actually, her response to that might tell you something about why she's interested in a writer like Shields. But
What does it tell you?
well, think about it while I introduce you. Okay, so Nora Foster Stovel is a professor emerita from the Department of English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta. I was trying to count the number of books she has published. I finally just asked her, and she can't remember. She thinks it's 17. 17 books as author or editor, and that includes works on Carol Shields, Margaret Atwood, Margaret Lawrence, Margaret Drabble, D.H. Lawrence, yes, and Jane Austen. So she has written widely during her career. She is currently working on a monograph on Shields' work entitled, or at least she had hoped to entitle it, Sparkling Subversion, Carol Shields' Vision and Voice. She tells me she's just discovered that somebody else has used this title, not about Shields, but now she has to think about whether or not she can use that title. An interesting thing that you might not know about Nora is that she actually didn't set out to be a scholar and teacher to begin with. She actually trained to be a ballet dancer. If you've ever seen her move across a room, you might guess that. But also she taught dance for many years, and she continues to hold membership in the Imperial Society of Teachers of Dance in England and the Canadian Dance Teachers Association. So in addition to her scholarly work, she has that to her credit. I'm going to ask Nora to speak a little bit about the book that she has just edited, some of her main interests in it, Then I'm going to put a few questions to her. I've had an opportunity to read the book, so we'll talk about it a little bit, and then I want to turn it over to you. I suspect that there are people in the room who know Shield's work better than I do, and might have some interesting comments and considerations for Nora. So Nora, do you want to tell us a little bit about this book and what you've done with it and why?
Yes, thank you, Mavis. And first of all, I'd just like to thank you for very kindly introducing me and hosting this. I'd like to thank McNally Robinson. Very impressive. It's my first visit here, and especially Daniel and John. And I'd like to thank the University of Alberta Press for publishing this book, and it's been a wonderful team to work with. And thank you, Jill, my editor, and Barbara, the production manager. Did I get it right? Senior editor, and the director, and also the, I think, sales manager, Sarah Enns, who can't be here today because she's on her honeymoon in Greece, so we won't feel too sorry for Sarah, but I miss having her here. So yes, I'm just going to say before I talk about this book, I'm just going to say that every spring following the University Congress that many of us attend in the spring, I would go on to Ottawa and spend a week in the National Library looking at Carol Shield's work. And there are over 200 boxes of files, and all of those boxes have, you know, maybe 20 files, and all those files have many pages. And it's I did this for 10 years. And I just want to read you a very, very short poem that I found handwritten at the end of a manuscript. It's titled April in Ottawa. Behind the National Library, beneath the rapids, rooted to a narrow rock, a small tree buds. And I was so pleased to find that, because I realized that Carol Shields had been where I was and had been doing what I was doing. And so I gave that poem the last word at the end of her collection of poems, which was published by McGill Queens. So I'm actually going to I've called this book rather mischievously, The Canadian Shields. And so in my introduction, and tonight I'm just going to read a very, very short, condensed version of that introduction, in which, like a heavyweight boxer, I defend my title. How did American-born author Carol Ann Warner become the quintessential Canadian writer, Carol Shields? Shields became a Canadian author first by reading Canadian writers. First, Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery in her childhood, then the Honeyman Festival by Marian Engel, and then The Stone Angel by Margaret Lawrence. And the very next year, she registered as a master's student at the University of Ottawa to study Canadian literature, of all things, composing a dissertation on 19th century Canadian pioneer writer Susanna Moodie. Shields also became a Canadian author by writing about Canada, composing numerous essays celebrating Canadian subjects, including Winnipeg, the Canada Council, and Canadian women's fiction, collected in the Canadian Shields, stories and essays. But Carol Shields didn't just write about Canada. She also wrote Canada, setting novels in Canadian locales, including The Republic of Love, set here in Winnipeg. No wonder Winnipeggers revere Shields, establishing a hedge maze and a bronze bust in her honor in 2009. Carol Ann Warner made the first step towards becoming a Canadian writer by crossing the 49th parallel with her young Canadian husband, Donald Hugh Shields, entering Canada with her ironing board in the back of their old blue 6-cylinder Ford in 1957, serendipitously the year that the Canada Council, of which she later became a valued member, was founded. In her poem, in her essay, Coming to Canada in the Canadian Shields, she recalls people asking, wasn't it a terrible wrench to leave the country of your birth? But she was too much in love to care. Years later, I understood what it means to cross a border, she reports. Moving to a new country was like falling down a dark hole, but for a long while I was too busy to notice. She acknowledges this is perhaps one of the easiest immigrations in the world, but adds, nevertheless, and I think you who have undergone the transplantation experience will understand this. Nevertheless, it took me years to understand how things worked in my adopted country, the political system, the intricacies and pressures of geography, the Canadian character. Shields was puzzled by many questions, such as what was the difference between a prime minister and a premier? Kilometers and centimeters, Fahrenheit and Celsius. What lay behind the mysterious initials, CBC, NRC, NFB, and the acronym SHRK? Actually, religious studies people pronounce it shriek. I think that's the influence of all those martyrs. In her essay, The Feminine Line, included in Canadian Shields, she acknowledges, I find as an immigrant, a woman fiction writer in midlife, that I have more questions than I have answers. For example, she was puzzled by the joke, why did the Canadian cross the road? Especially by the answer, to get to the middle. 13 years after immigrating, Shields applied for Canadian citizenship. Her dual citizenship allowed her the distinction of being the only writer to win the Governor General's Award for Fiction and the Pulitzer Prize for The Stone Diaries, catapulting her to instant fame. Her daughter, Anne Giardini, affirms, my mother is a completely Canadian writer, adding parenthetically, whatever that means, who was born and raised in the US. Shields also became truly Canadian as a result of living in several major Canadian cities, beginning in Toronto and Ottawa for a decade, continuing for over 2 decades in Winnipeg, and finishing in Vancouver and Victoria, with years in Manchester, Birmingham, and Berkeley, plus sabbaticals in France, where the family purchased a house. She lived longer than anywhere in Winnipeg, where she taught English literature and creative writing at the University of Manitoba and served as Chancellor of the University of Winnipeg. Canadian writer Guy Vanderhaeghe recalls a visit to a Canadian literature class at an American college, I can no longer remember what college, where students had read The Republic of Love. Some women students said they wanted to move to Winnipeg because it is such a romantic city. They said, it's a city of love. Shields and Winnipeg enjoyed a mutual love affair, as Winnipeg laid claim to Carol Shields, as one critic put it, while she was the epitome of the good citizen. There is an emblematic story explaining why Carol and Don Shields took Winnipeg to their hearts. After they ran out of gas on the Pembina Highway on a cold winter night, a city bus pulled up and the driver ordered all able-bodied men aboard to push their car to the nearest gas station. Shields affirmed, we soon realized that everything was there that we needed or wanted. We had our daily rituals and a huge network of friends. It provided the most complete sense of community that I had known since growing up in the American Midwest. Shields' interest in Canadian literature persisted. In her essay, Writing from the Edge, she observes, we can, speaking roughly and without stepping on too many toes, take the year 1960 as the real beginning of our literature. That was the year, just to peg it for you, when there were 5 Canadian novels published in English in Canada. 5! If anybody knows what those 5 are, I would just love to hear it, because I can't seem to discover it. Later, she observed, looking at writing in Canada, the storyboard does seem to be growing here rather than shrinking. Voices formerly at the margin are now being heard, bringing with them their different rhythms and their alternate expectations. More is permitted, more can be said. Noting that the Canada Council was founded in 1957, the year she immigrated to Canada, she asserts, Canada, this country on the edge, can afford its own culture. Soon after becoming a Canadian citizen, Shields categorized herself as a Canadian writer, referring to we Canadians and to the centennial celebrations of Confederation in 1967 as our centenary. When she talks about the unity of our country in the essay that name in this book, she is referring to Canada. And she emphasizes the importance of the arts in defining a community and the importance of the Canada Council as a unifying force. At the outset of Writing from the Edge, she declares, now I'm going to contribute to the nexus of Canadian identity, because Canadians these days are directing serious attention to that very seething, smoking, chaotic, multicultural muddle that is, in fact, our reality. This is risky. One almost wants to whisper, I'm Canadian. She acknowledges that it is difficult to compare Canadian literature with that of the United States because, she says, Canadian writing, reflecting the immigration patterns of the country, is more community-centered, while American writing focuses on the individual. The Canadian who are we, rather than the American who am I. You can think of somebody who may focus on who am I. Carol Shields lived in Canada for 46 years, or over 2/3 of her life, twice as long as she lived in the USA. Nevertheless, it was many years before immigrating to Canada before she wrote these words in her poem, Coming to Canada, age 22. It took years to happen, and years before come back soon changed to here and now and home, the place I came to, the place I was from. Carol Shields had traveled a great distance from coming to Canada to coming from Canada. Although she died much too soon, shortly after her 65th birthday in July 2003, with her novel Segue in draft and many other novels in mind, she left us the legacy of her oeuvre. We are bereft, her daughter Anne Giardini lamented, because she had many novels left to write. We are left with her distinctive voice recorded in her writing, expressing her unique vision. As Margaret Atwood affirms, and live she did, and live she does. For as John Keats remarked, every writer has two souls, an earthly one and one that lives on in the world of writing as a voice in the writing itself. It's this voice, astute, compassionate, observant, and deeply human, that will continue to speak to her readers everywhere. So you can disagree with me later if you like in the discussion period. So I'm just going to say a little bit about what's in this book, and perhaps now or later read a few sentences from her essays. Daniel has already mentioned that it contains 50 items of Shields' writing. Half of them never before published, a few stories and many essays. The other half, essays that were published in various journals and magazines, such as En Route magazine and women's magazines, but never before collected. So I'm just going to mention a few titles, just to give you a sense of the range. Some of the I'll mention two of the stories. The one that I like best was called Pain, P-A-I-N. I changed the title with the permission of her eldest daughter, Anne Giardini, who's the director of the Carol Shields Literary Trust, to protein dust, a phrase that resonates throughout the story. And she said, that's fine. She said, P-A-I-N just makes me think of French bread. Of course, you know, the whole family is totally bilingue, having spent many summers and sabbaticals in France. The other one I changed rather quietly was the story titled, Some Things Only Happen Once. And I added the phrase or the title, The Golden Boy, because that's the focal point of the story. And I thought that just made sense. But I'll just mention a few titles. Did anything much happen to you in the 50s? Writers are readers first, the reader-writer arc, the writer's second self, the writing life, my back pages, women's voices in literature. And here we begin to see the feminist in Shields coming forward. Women in the short story, the feminine line, the new Canadian fiction, writers gender swapping, the unity of our country. I've always meant to tell you, a letter to my mother, at home in Winnipeg, living at home, my favorite place, at home in deepest France, travel warp, rare petals, a purse of one's own, parties, real and otherwise, the visual arts, the best teacher I ever had, the delicate balancing act, divorce. So I could read a few sentences, or I could do that later, whatever you.
I think you've got a few minutes to read a few
Okay, all right,
sentences and then
okay,
we'll start talking.
okay, okay. I'll just read, I'm not going to read a whole essay or story. I'm just going to read a few sentences here and there. This is from Did Anything Happen to You in the 50s? High school, university, going abroad, marriage, immigration, the birth of 2 children, that's all. Because I'm a novelist, it has sometimes been, and I'm borrowing Dave Williams' edition here, so because I flew and I didn't want to carry a lot of books, so I don't have these marked, but he's kindly marked this very paragraph that I wanted to read. Because I'm a novelist, it has sometimes been useful for me to imagine a life as possessing roughly the shape of a novel. I don't mean that I'm willing to confuse fact with fiction, illusion with reality. I'm talking about the structure of a novel, and particularly the fact that novels fall into chapters, separate chapters in time and space, but chapters which are joined by an overriding narrative line, or what I like to think of as the spine of the story. And so she came to think of her life in terms of chapters. There was this chapter when she was having 5 children. There was a chapter after they were in school when she started writing. There was a chapter when she was diagnosed with terminal cancer, the last chapter. I had the good fortune to spend 3 days with her in May 2003, not all day, but a couple of hours each day. So that was her last chapter. Okay, here's the end of an essay titled Others. And of course, Others was the title of her first collection of poetry. And I long ago understood that the silences our society imposes, giving to the novelist, give to the novelist a freshness of opportunity, a way to bring spaciousness and art into the smallest, most ordinary, in quotes, lives. Even so, I suffer, as many writers do, from a scavenger's guilt, and always experience a desire to include on the title page of my books some small message of acknowledgement. Forgive me, or I'm sorry. And of course, those of us who know Margaret Lawrence's wonderful collection of short stories, A Bird in the House, know that sorry is the magic word in Canada. This one is called A Purse of One's Own, and I think it was in something like Chatelaine. That's got to be in my annotations here, but I won't look it up. A woman's handbag, I understood even then as a child, was part of her being, an extension of her style and her soul, spiritual partner to her hat, her gloves, her everyday pumps. Later, I came to suspect that the inside of a handbag is also the single inviolable space a woman possesses, other than the labyrinth of her own thoughts. And this evening, I found that it's a space in which one can temporarily lose one's cell phone. This is the opening sentence of Heidi's Conundrum, which was, I think it was a Black Hole Theatre or Winnipeg Theatre Exchange production of a play. And the title goes, Feminism sailed into the 60s like a dazzling ocean liner, powered by injustice and steaming with indignation. Then there's one called Parties. She always has parties in her in her novels. Parties real and otherwise, she concludes, I am an invisible presence at this gathering, an authorly mouse under a fictional chair. This is the end of her afterword to drop threads, what we aren't told. We move through our chapters, here we go with our chapters again, with gratitude. Who isn't renewed by startling scenery or refreshed by undreamed of freedoms? Surprise keeps us alive, liberates our senses. I thought for a while that a serious illness had interrupted my chaptered life. But no, it is a chapter on its own. Living with illness requires new balancing skills. It changes everything, and I need to listen to it, attend to it, and bring to it a stern, new sense of housekeeping. But I have time for this last exercise, all the time in the world. And that leads me to read a part of one more poem. And I'm just trying to remember what page I found this on. 142. Happiness. And those of you who are familiar with Unless will recognize the final metaphor. Being happy, 1949. Okay, I'll just read the end of it. Happiness was not what I thought, a useful monotony, something you could trust. It was the lucky pane of glass you carried about in your head. It took all your cunning just to hang on to it. And underneath its smooth surface waited a raging cavity with no way out.
So should we leave it that to linger for the audience for a bit while we?
I just want to finish with one thing.
Okay.
Two things. At the end of her afterward to Drop Threads 2, I'm honored to be part of this ongoing project, which locates itself at the juncture of my two favorite things, language and the company of women. And I have chosen to include as the epigraph a sentence from one of her essays. How wonderful to be a woman living and writing in Canada.
That's lovely. Yes, you're right. That's a better way to end. Thank you so much, Nora. It's a really interesting collection, and it was a privilege to read. As you can see, I read and marked.
Very well prepared.
Well, I've read and marked a lot. You mentioned, of course, Winnipeg, and I think maybe that's where I'm going to start, because many of us here are well aware of the fact that Shields lived in Winnipeg for more than 20 years, and as you said, longer than she lived anywhere else in Canada. And
anywhere else, period.
Oh, anywhere else, period, including, yeah, that, I suppose that's right, because even in her childhood, she had left, before she was 20, she left home. So, and I think it's true that Winnipeg took Carol Shields to its heart. You say that in your introduction. I've said it here tonight as well. But it is, I think, clear that Shields also took Winnipeg to her heart. Mm-hmm. And I was interested in a piece you reprint here. It was published first, I think, in the 90s in a magazine called Canadian Living, entitled At Home in Winnipeg. So this is, I think, a good example of one of the pieces that Nora includes in the collection that would be hard for any of us to locate. And it's a very interesting piece. She talks there about experiencing a shock of instant recognition, the sweet, settled bliss of feeling at home when she arrived in Winnipeg. And I had never seen that description in any of her other works. In that piece as well, she talks about trying to unravel the feeling because she herself finds it surprising, shocking, in fact. And she speculates at one point that perhaps she feels a shock of recognition because she has, and this is a quotation, a perverse liking for geography that is modest, blunt, and untidy around the edges. And I found that such an interesting description about geography, and as I was sort of thinking about those terms, I began to wonder whether they also expressed values that can be found in Shields' work. So in particular, I was thinking about her attribution of modesty to the geography, because she uses, at one point, one of the essays, now I won't place it very quickly. I probably could find it in one of my notes there. But she actually praises a novel that she thinks is modest in its achievement. So I'm curious, Nora, do those terms, modest, blunt, and untidy around the edges, could they be said to characterize Shield's own writing or her values in her writing in any way?
Well, I think that she as a person was renowned for being very modest, even after she won all those awards and something like 24 honorary degrees were conferred on her. She remained very generous and modest. And when I met her in 2003, after first meeting her in 93, and 93 was just before she became famous and won the Pulitzer. And in 2003, of course, that had all happened. She was just as friendly and down to earth. So I think she was exceptionally modest. Blunt, I think she didn't suffer fools gladly. And some of her students have said that she concealed, what is it, the acerbic sharpness beneath the surface sweetness or something like that, which is not to suggest that she was at all hypocritical, but while she was a very nice person, she was no fool. So rough around the edges, I think.
Untidy.
Okay. I think that she loved randomness, and I think we see that in all of her writing. And scholar and critic Marta Dvorak has an article on a couple of articles, one on randomness and one on chaos. And the one on chaos was she contributed to a collection that I edited for Paul Ray Macmillan, came out last year, to which Warren Carey also contributed, and it's a very interesting essay. Unfortunately, the book retails for something like £125, so nobody can afford to buy it. Why, I do not know. I can only speculate.
Well, there's a reason for libraries, right? The libraries can afford to place it, and then you need to go to the library, which isn't a bad thing either. So you mentioned another book, that you've been working on in relation to Shields, and of course you've been working. You gave us that story about working in the archives over many years with the, did you say 200 boxes of material? So you've been working with Carol Shields writing for many years now, and of course you've published 2 previous collections, the collected poetry, Carol Shields in 2021, and relating Carol Shields essays and fiction, Crossing Borders in 2023. I know you're also working on the monograph. So I was interested in having you think aloud a little bit about what have you learned about Shields' writing practices, or what have you learned about her writing practices that you did not know before you collected these essays and stories? Is there anything that this collection seems to you, any way in which the work on this collection changed or complicated your view of either Shields or her work?
Well, I've learned lots of things about her writing practices over the years. One of the things that I think is so interesting, I think some really ambitious graduate students should, perhaps in computer science and literature, should attack this, and that is the point at which she got a computer and started composing on the computer as opposed to an old manual typewriter. And then we could attribute this, well, not so much to Margaret Lawrence, because Lawrence didn't like computer. She really was very happy with her old manual typewriter. But with Carol Shields, then we get a kind of layering of her narrative that she didn't do quite so much of. It wasn't so easy for her to do with a typewriter. But that's not something something I learned earlier. Another thing that I learned was when I was interviewing her in 2003 in Victoria, and Dawn came into she was in bed and she was very weak. She was dying, and I was sitting by her bed in a little white wicker chair. And Dawn came in with a tray with cheese and bread and a bottle of wine, and he said, "Let's pretend we're in France." So then he told me that when they were in France, renting an apartment in a chateau, I guess for the summer or the sabbatical, when the kids were in school, it must be the sabbatical because the kids were going to school. She would write when the kids were in school, like Margaret Lawrence. I think I've also done a lot of work. A great writer also from Manitoba. And Dawn would have to vacate the house so she could concentrate and write. And he said it rained a lot, so he would have to sit in the car and read. He said I gave plenty of time to plan lunch. So that tells you something about her degree of concentration. Margaret Lawrence also wrote only when her children were at school, but not before she made all the beds and washed all the dishes. But this one, I think, because it combines stories and essays, mostly essays, made me think a little bit more about the relationship and the differences between the two for Carol Shields. Because I think in her essays, we have a very, very good sense, a very strong sense of her personal voice, as if she's speaking to you. And in fact, many of the essays were originally written as talks or speeches. So she's very aware of her audience or her reader. But it also made me realize the differences in techniques in the fiction and in the essays, and also a matter of voice in the sense that a writer, when writing fiction, or even more when writing drama, wears a mask, right? Or even in the case of poetry, the persona speaking the poem is not necessarily the poet herself. But I think in an essay, you do have an author's voice more directly. So I think the fiction and nonfiction, but also, I mean, that collection relating Carol Shields, fiction and nonfiction, over a dozen eminent Canadianist scholars and critics, scholars of Carol Shields, read her novels and some of her stories through the lens of her essays, because in the essays, she identifies her goals, her aims as a creative writer. And increasingly as a feminist.
So reading especially the first section, the unpublished talks and essays and stories, I found myself thinking, didn't I just read that? I was often reading in bed and thinking, okay, did I just read that? So I would reread it and realize that she also reuses things quite a lot. And so I did check that out a couple of times, and if there was a phrase that, or a metaphor, let's say, that she found resonant, she seems to have reworked it in another piece, often in a different context, slightly.
Or a different show?
Yes, exactly. So I just wondered whether that was something that you would say is characteristic of her, the sort of reusing.
Definitely. She said in one of her essays, my mother would never throw out 2 tablespoons of peas if she could help it. And Shields exhibits the same kind of thrift, and she will reuse things. And in fact, some of her novels, including Larry's Party, began as a story. I think Alice also began as a story, and she gave 2 papers at Jane Austen conferences, and she includes them as appendices to her Life of Jane Austen, Penguin Life of Jane Austen. So I think that she is very thrifty, and she does, like Margaret Lawrence again, include her own juvenilia in her adult fiction. So it's kind of meta-autobiographical, I guess we have to call it. Certainly, Lawrence says that a lot in The Diviners. In fact, well, this is not going to be a talk on Margaret Lawrence, but that novel was many times longer, and her editor, Judith Jones in New York, had her cut out almost all of Maura Gunn's fictions, almost all.
So you mentioned before that she's very conscious of her readers. And of course, there is that essay that in fact is titled The Reader-Writer Arc, which I found very telling. So she does talk about herself as, in that essay, writers are readers first, about herself as a reader. But then she also is very interested in her own readers. And she sees the readers as really completing that reader-writer arc, which I thought was an interesting way of thinking about it. I know in one of her essays about other writing, she talks with she clearly enjoys what she calls fiction that lets the reader in, that's respectful of readers. So she thinks a lot about her readers. And I'm interested in the fact that Shields is clear from your work, I mean, has worked in many genres, so poetry, essays, short stories, plays, as well as novels. And, you know, arguably genres always imply different forms of attention in reading, arguably even different readers. And so I'm curious about that. Do you think Shields is seeking different readers in her various genres? Or no? I mean, she works across the genres like that, and she is very interested in an audience. So did she always imagine her audience in the same way? Did she seem to imply different readers in different genres?
I can see a picture of the golden boy up there. I think it's a complex question. I mean, for example, when I met her or interviewed her in 2003, I really felt that it was unfair because I had been reading it, and so had my husband, Stovel, been reading her work for many years, and she didn't know anything about me. So it seemed really kind of unfair and unbalanced. I don't know whether I could say that she writes in each genre for a different reader. I think perhaps she does, but perhaps she's writing from a different aspect of herself as well. And I think it's important for people to know that, for example, that her first 2 books were collections of poetry before she ever wrote a novel. She wrote and had published and had produced plays, right? Dave Williamson co-authored a play with her titled Anniversary in the 80s, early 90s, yeah. And of course she wrote essays, she wrote a biography, a kind of biography of Jane Austen. She wrote literary criticism of Susanna Moody's trashy, what she calls trashy Harlequin romance novels. So perhaps she envisioned a different reader for each. And certainly, as I mentioned, in her essays, especially those that began as speeches or talks, or composed as speeches or talks, she's very much speaking to real people who were there, and she imagines, you know, their reaction, and her texts are filled with questions, you know, as she addresses them.
So I think it's fair to say, though, that Shields, now again, I'm not a Shields specialist, I know there are others in the audience who are, who will correct me, but my impression is that certainly Shields has been paid by professional readers, by critics. Most attention has been paid to her as a novelist. So I guess part of the reason I was interested in this question about different forms of attention or readership that she might seek is just whether we are being well served. I mean, are we missing out on an important part of Shields and her imagination and the world she has created for readers by focusing on her novels?
Well, I think that most of us read novels for relaxation more often than we read poetry or plays. But I'm also, it isn't just the general reader, it's also a lot of critics and scholars of Shields focus primarily on her novels and don't really pay much attention to her poetry, her essays, her plays, her biography, her literary criticism. And I think we find the same in other authors. I'm thinking, for example, of Margaret Atwood, who has worked in many genres tremendously successfully, but people mostly focus on her novels. So in my monograph that I tell you I'm hoping to call Sparkling Subversion. And by the way, when she read my proposal, my short proposal, she liked it. That meant a lot to me. And she particularly liked that phrase. I said, well, it's your phrase. And she said, oh, is it? And I said, yes, it's from the Stone Diaries. And then I call it Sparkling Subversion, Carol Shields' Vision and Voice. And that's because she titled her study of Moody, which was an MA thesis at Ottawa that she revised and published as voice and vision. And I thought it should be vision and then voice. And she said, yes, I should have said vision and then voice because vision comes before voice. So that was the rationale for that title. And so what I'm trying to do in that study of all of her writing is to see how, not only how interesting and good, how deft her poems are, how accessible, but how much that influenced and informed her writing of novels. Because she became honed her ability to deal with language, and especially her ability to create metaphor, and that carried over into her prose writing. But also her plays, which of course informed her sense of dramatic structure, something that she admired in Jane Austen, that she admired the way Jane Austen sets a scene, and then of course it honed her ability to create dialogue, and her dialogue and her novels is so good that she doesn't even have to identify the speakers. You already know the characters of the speakers, you recognize their idiom, and you know who's speaking at any given point, and so on with her interest in biography and her literary criticism and her essays and so on. So I think it really is time to look at the whole picture, as I tried to do with Margaret Lawrence in my rather audaciously titled Divining Margaret Lawrence monograph.
Thank you so much, Nora. That was very, very interesting. And we do have 10 minutes left, perhaps less than we had hoped, but I wonder if there are questions other people would like to ask Nora to speak about.
They don't have to leave a date, do they?
I don't think anybody's gonna kick them out, no.
We close it back, so you have plenty of time.
All right, we've got lots of time for questions.
However, this will be done at 8.
I see Warren Carey, please.
Thank you. Yeah, it's wonderful to hear you, both of you talking about this book, which I'm really looking forward to reading. I guess, Mavis, you were talking about Carol Schiltz's care for her readers, and I guess the thing that one of the things that I think is most remarkable about her work is the affect, the emotion that her readers not only felt, I guess, on their own, but that they felt a community. And I think there really was, certainly here in Manitoba, but I think it was much broader than that too, that readers of Shields felt that they had a kind of companionship with one another almost, that there was a community of readers there. Was she aware of that, or did she think of her readers as a community in a way, or did she I guess get a sense of their emotional engagement, I guess, with her work? Did she reflect on that in a way?
I don't think she talks about that as far as I'm aware, and she probably was aware of it. I mean, she was very perceptive and sensitive, and I know she really enjoyed coffee clutches and lunches with friends, so she had her own community. And because I don't live in Winnipeg, I'm sure you have much more sense of that here than I can do elsewhere. But I do remember my college roommate at McGill, who lives in Ontario, in Toronto, told me that when she heard that Carol Shields had died, she wept. So I think a lot of, and it isn't just women. As I said, my husband was very much enjoying her work. I think that something about her humanity touches people and perhaps creates a sense of community. Thanks,
I was gonna say there's one essay, I think one of the forewords though that you republish here, where she does talk about how she felt one of her novels, now I'm not remembering which one, was almost communally written, because she talks about teaching at U of M at the time and trying to work out various problems in the novel and sort of grabbing anyone she felt met in the hall and asking them about
Is it Larry's party?
I think
She
it might
talked
have
to a
been.
lot of male friends, because with her friends over lunch or coffee, they raised the question. Of course, this is when the feminist movement was getting going. A lot of men felt threatened, including academic men. Then they raised the question of what is it like to be a man in the late 20th century? And that's what gave her the idea to write Larry's Party. And she canvassed a lot of her friends, and some of them named Larry. Larry Krotz his daughter is a colleague of mine. He was one of the Larrys. And there was another Larry, I think his name was actually Larry Willard. And he came up to her, I think after a reading or a book launch or whatever, and he said, How did you know? And he thought that she actually was writing from his life.
You know, the one thing I would say in response to that question though too, Warren, is there is an essay where she seems to imagine the reader and the writer in this very intimate connection where she actually almost talks about the writer whispering in the ear of the reader. And so, I mean, it may speak to the affect question, but it was such an intimate image, right? That she says, and then she ends that essay by talking about this really extraordinary communication that a writer can have with the reader. But the image she uses is actually a very intimate one of us sort of whispering into the ear of the reader.
I was thinking of that when you mentioned it, and in fact, her daughter was giving, I think it was a TV interview or something like that, and she thought she heard her mother whisper into her ear, "Be serene."
Be serene. Thanks for the question. Is there another one?
Or would any of you like to comment? Like Dave might want to talk about working with Carol on Anniversary, or Warren might like to talk about Larry's Party, or other readers. Or might like to talk, Barbara might like to talk about this book, or Jill, you both know the book so well.
I'll double check the stream as well. We might have a couple comments on
Oh,
there.
Well, while you're checking that, so I have a question Nora told me I wasn't supposed to ask her, but I'm going to ask it now since there are 5 minutes. And so one of the things that really struck me is the number of times that Shields uses the imagery of either margins or edges in describing herself as a writer. So sometimes she talks about that. I think you maybe alluded to that quotation about Canadians writing from an edge. She sometimes talks about Winnipeg writers or writers in the West as writing from a kind of marginal place. Often she talks about it in relation to being a woman writer. But I was thinking here about, you know, placing Shields. I mean, it's now more than 20 years since she's passed. And in those 20 years, I mean, those of us who work in cultural texts know that a lot has shifted. And we have been taught, I think, in a way to interrogate the whole question of centers and margins and where we place those in relation to the kind of anti-racist, indigenous, LGBTQ, post-colonial kinds of theorizing and writing that's been done. So when I was reading Shields' representation of herself as writing from an edge, I was thinking, how does a scholar in 2024 respond to Shields' representation of herself, a heterosexual, white, middle-class woman as writing from an edge? How do you deal with that or think about edges and margins in relation to sort of Shields' claims now?
Well, I'm actually perfectly happy to answer that question. We think, for example, you know, we don't really think of Shakespeare as an anti-Semitist, even though he wrote The Merchant of Venice, nor do we think of him really as an anti-feminist, even though he wrote, it's escaping me.
Taming of
The Taming of the Shrew, thank you. Oh, what a great title. Change either of those words and it would be quite different. No, we have to view him as a man, as a writer writing in the context, and as a person, as a man of his time. And Carol Shields also as a person of her time. And so much has changed, as you suggest, in the last 2 decades that she would not have known. But I think also she came from the middle class and the Midwest. And even in Winnipeg, she's in the middle of the country. And at the same time, she felt that that was on the edge, in a way, culturally. Although Winnipeg or Chicago is in the middle of the country, it was not in the middle culturally as, say, New York was, or other parts of the US, or Toronto in Canada, or Vancouver, other cities. And I think she felt also that women were still on the edge, and all of that was changing. And I think one of the things I see, if I can't use sparkling subversion, I might use subversive feminist, because one of the things I see is her writing becoming more explicitly or consciously feminist. She said to me when I interviewed her, I think I was the last feminist to wake up in the world. But wake up she did. And one of the other thing I trace is that as her work becomes more explicitly feminist, she adopts more increasingly postmodernist techniques to embody that increasingly feminist voice. So the vision and the voice are very much related.
Thanks. Were there questions that?
Not online, so we are doing pretty good. Yeah, if you want, we can do some more questions over here.
Well, we have a question there, great.
Just wanted to mention what a quick learner that Carol was. And when I had been writing TV plays and she had never tried a play. So she asked me if I would co-write a play with her so she could learn how to write a play. But it took us a while. We had a lot of fun doing it, but we couldn't find anybody interested in it at first. And in the meantime, I saw a play called The Dining Room, which was
Gurney.
Pardon?
Gurney?
Yes, A.R. Gurney, which was one of the funniest plays I ever saw. And it was a group, the actors, there were only 9 actors, and they continually changed to other kinds of people. So the dining room was the dining room of many different people. And so I told Carol about this play, you gotta see it. She went to see it, and the result was her play, Departures and Arrivals. I think it's called Arrivals and Departures, isn't it? Anyway,
No, it's Departures and Arrivals.
yeah, and so that was how fast she got that produced before we ever got anniversary.
And I was fortunate to see it at the, here in Montreal, I'm sorry, Winnipeg, I just was in Edmonton this morning. Winnipeg, the 2009 Carol Shields inaugural conference.
Yeah, right.
And it's terrific, really.
Well, thank you, Nora, for taking all that time to introduce us to the book. And as I said, it's definitely worth reading, as you can see from my reading of it. Yes, we're looking forward to the monograph as well, but please join me in thanking Nora for introducing this book to us. The fact that it is the University of Manitoba Press.
What did I say?
You said University. I won't tell you. University of Manitoba Press, and thank you to the press and to McNally Robinson for sponsoring us this evening.
We call it jet lag.
And thank you both, Drs. Stovel and Reimer. We'll now move along to the signing portion of the evening. And so please feel free to approach the signing table to have your book signed. You don't have to pay for it right now, so long as you pay for it before you leave, then everything is cool. And thank you once again to the University of Manitoba Press, and for all of you for joining us, and of course to Mavis Reimer and Nora Foster Stovel. Please join me in acknowledging them and have a wonderful night.
Thanks very much.